The human frigate looked like a rusted nail floating beside a palace made of glass. That was the first thing Commander Ethan Hale noticed as his ship docked at the orbital station above Velthara, the throne world of the Sithari Dominion. The station itself was a work of art, built from living crystal that pulsed with soft blue light. His ship, by comparison, was ugly, scarred, and covered in blast marks from a dozen battles. He liked it that way. Things that survived always looked a little rough. Ethan stepped off the boarding ramp in his formal military uniform, dark gray with silver rank pins on the collar. 2 Sithari guards waited for him. They were tall, nearly 7 feet, with smooth skin that glowed faintly like moonlight on water. Their eyes were large and pale, and they moved with the kind of grace that made everything around them look clumsy. They looked at Ethan the way someone might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a royal garden. "Commander Hale," one of them said. His voice was flat. "Follow us." They did not welcome him. They did not bow. They simply turned and walked, expecting him to keep up with their long strides. Ethan followed without complaint. He had not come here expecting kindness. The walk through the orbital palace took nearly 20 minutes. Every hallway was more beautiful than the last, walls of flowing liquid light, floors that hummed with gentle warmth, ceilings that opened into views of distant nebulae. Sithari courtiers passed him in robes of woven starlight, and every single one of them stared. Some whispered. A few did not even bother to lower their voices. "That is the human. He is so small. She cannot be serious." Ethan kept his eyes forward and his face calm. He had trained himself long ago to hear everything and react to nothing. He was here for one reason. He was here for Calith. Lady Calith Sorvan was the 3rd daughter of the Arch-Sovereign, the supreme ruler of the Sithari Dominion, a civilization that had controlled 100 star systems for 10,000 years. The Sithari were old, powerful, and proud. They had mastered psionic energy, built ships that could fold space like paper, and created works of art that lasted longer than most human nations. They considered themselves the highest form of intelligent life in the known galaxy. And one of their princesses had chosen to bond with a human. It had happened during the siege of Rithai's Vale, a brutal frontier war against the Hive Marrow Collective, a species of biomechanical horrors that consumed entire planets. The Sithari and humans had fought side by side for the first time. Ethan had led a unit of human marines into the breach when the Sithari defensive line collapsed. In the chaos, he had found Calith, separated from her guard, surrounded, and moments from death. He had fought through 6 Hive drones to reach her, taken a spike through his left shoulder, and carried her to the extraction point with one working arm. That was how it started, not with romance but with blood and survival. In the weeks that followed, as both their forces recovered, they talked. She was nothing like the cold, distant nobles he had seen at diplomatic functions. She was sharp, curious, and unafraid to challenge him. He was blunt, steady, and unimpressed by her title. They argued about tactics, laughed about the absurdity of war, and slowly, carefully began to trust each other with things neither of them had shared with anyone else. When Calith announced her intention to take Ethan as her bonded consort, the Dominion had reacted as if she had set fire to the throne itself. Humans were considered a juvenile species. They had only been part of the galactic community for 2 centuries. They had no psionic abilities, no ancient bloodlines, no cultural achievements that the Sithari considered worthy of respect. To the noble houses, humans were useful soldiers at best, strong, stubborn, and willing to die in large numbers. But they were not equals. They were certainly not worthy of marrying into the imperial bloodline. Ethan knew all of this. He had known it when he said yes to Calith. He had known it during the 6-month journey to Velthara, and he knew it now, as the guards led him into the grand reception hall where the pre-bonding gathering was already underway. The hall was enormous. Hundreds of Sithari nobles filled the space, their glowing skin creating a sea of soft light. Music played from somewhere, not instruments, but voices, harmonizing in frequencies that made the air itself vibrate. Tables floated at waist height, covered in food that looked like sculpted jewels. Every conversation stopped when Ethan walked in. He felt the silence like a weight. Then slowly, the conversations resumed, but now they were all about him. A tall Sithari male broke away from a group and approached. He wore robes of deep violet, and the glow of his skin was brighter than most, a sign of noble blood. His face was beautiful in the way a blade is beautiful, all sharp angles and cold elegance. This was Lord Vithos' kin, Duke of the Third Reach, commander of the largest private fleet in the Dominion, and the man who had expected to be Calith's consort before Ethan existed. So, Vithos said, looking down at Ethan with a smile that held no warmth, "This is the princess's exotic pet." Laughter rippled through the nearest group of nobles. Vithos did not look at them, but he clearly enjoyed the sound. Ethan met his gaze. He said nothing, but he studied the man, the way he stood, the way others positioned themselves around him, the subtle signals of power and alliance. Vithos was not just an angry suitor, he was a politician, and this was a performance. Ethan filed that away and moved on. He found a place near the edge of the hall, accepted a drink he did not intend to finish, and watched. He watched who laughed at Vithos's jokes and who stayed silent. He watched which houses stood together and which kept their distance. He noted the older nobles who studied him with calculating eyes rather than open scorn. He was a soldier, and a good soldier always mapped the battlefield before the first shot. Calith found him an hour later. She came through a side entrance, dressed in flowing silver, her skin glowing with a warm golden light that made every other Sithari in the room look pale. She was tall, elegant, and carried herself with the quiet authority of someone who had grown up knowing exactly who she was. But when she reached Ethan, her expression softened. "You survived the reception," she said. "Barely," he replied. "The food tried to fight back." She almost smiled, then her expression grew serious. "Ethan, the court will try to break you before the ceremony. They will use words, protocol, isolation, anything to make you leave on your own. You need to understand that. You can still walk away." He looked at her for a long moment. "I didn't cross 1,000 light years to flinch at people who have never bled for anything." Before she could respond, a horn sounded through the hall, deep, resonant, ancient. The crowd parted. An elderly Sithari in ceremonial armor stepped forward and spoke in a voice that carried to every corner. "By the authority of ancient law, I invoke the right of contestation. The worthiness of the proposed consort shall be tested before the bonding is sealed." The hall erupted in whispers. Calith's face went pale, truly pale, her glow dimming. Across the room, Lord Vithos' kin stood with his arms folded, and a cold, satisfied smile on his face. The trap had been set long before Ethan ever arrived. The right of contestation had not been invoked in over 800 years. Most Sithari thought of it as a relic, an old law from the violent days before the Dominion became civilized. But it had never been removed from the legal codes, and that was all Vithos needed. The rules were simple and cruel. Any noble of sufficient rank could challenge the worthiness of a royal consort before the bonding ceremony. The challenger would impose 3 trials: mind, body, and spirit. If the consort failed any one of them, the bonding would be dissolved, and the consort would be exiled from Dominion space forever. Ethan learned this from a legal advisor the morning after the reception. The advisor, a thin Sithari with nervous hands, explained the law quickly and left even quicker, as if being seen with the human was a disease he might catch. That was the first sign that Ethan was being isolated. Over the next 3 days, everything around him quietly fell apart. His Sithari attendants were reassigned without explanation. His human security detail, 4 Marines who had traveled with him from Earth, were denied access to the inner palace on grounds of ceremonial protocol. His communication link to Calith was cut. She had been taken into ritual purification, a traditional practice that separated bonding partners for 3 days before the ceremony. It was supposed to be a spiritual preparation. In this case, it was a convenient way to leave Ethan completely alone. He adapted. He had spent months alone behind enemy lines during the Rithai's Vale campaign. An empty palace room with running water and a soft bed was practically a vacation. But the court was not done with him. The insults came in waves, each one dressed up as something polite. A Sithari linguist visited him on the first morning, claiming to offer help with formal pronunciation for the ceremony. Within 10 minutes, the linguist was correcting every word Ethan spoke, clicking his tongue in disappointment, and suggesting that perhaps the human should simply remain silent during the bonding to avoid embarrassing Lady Caliph. Ethan thanked him for the advice and said nothing else. The linguist left looking unsatisfied, as if he had expected a reaction he did not get. At dinner that evening, a servant guided Ethan to a seat at the far end of the hall, past the noble tables, past the diplomatic tables, past even the merchant tables, all the way to a small bench near the kitchen entrance where minor trade clerks and cleaning staff ate. The message was obvious. Ethan sat down, ate the food placed in front of him, and made conversation with a bewildered Sithari janitor who had never spoken to a human before. By the end of the meal, the janitor was laughing at one of Ethan's stories about a malfunctioning airlock. Several nobles watched from across the hall with expressions that suggested this was not the outcome they had planned. On the second day, a Sithari general named Thavan sought him out. Thavan was broad-shouldered for a Sithari and carried himself with the stiffness of a career military officer. He sat across from Ethan in the guest quarters without being invited and began asking about human tactics during the siege of Rithai's Vale. "I have studied your species' approach to warfare," Thavan said. "It is remarkably simple. You throw bodies at a problem until it stops being a problem. The casualty rates are staggering." "They are," Ethan agreed. "Does that not concern you?" "Every single time." Thavan waited for more, but Ethan offered nothing else. The general frowned. "The Sithari way is precision, economy. We do not waste lives." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why your defensive line broke at Rithai's Vale. You pulled back when the cost got too high. My people walked into the fire because someone had to." Thavan's glow flickered, the Sithari equivalent of a flinch. He stood, said nothing more, and left. Ethan spent his free hours exploring the palace. He walked the long galleries where portraits of ancient Sithari warriors hung in frames of frozen light. He studied their armor, their weapons, their poses. He read the inscriptions beneath each one, stories of duels, conquests, and honor battles fought when the Sithari were still a young and hungry species. Before they built their crystal towers, they had been fighters, brutal ones. That history was buried now beneath 10,000 years of elegance, but it was still there in the bones of the architecture. He found the dueling galleries on the second evening, long, vaulted chambers with smooth floors and weapon racks along the walls. Most of the weapons were ceremonial, polished and pretty, and never used. But in a smaller room at the back, he found an ancient armory. The weapons here were different. They were simple, heavy, and scarred with use. Real weapons. Old weapons. A voice spoke from the shadows. "You have an eye for the honest things." Ethan turned. An elderly Sithari sat on a bench in the corner, so still that Ethan had walked right past him. He was old, truly old, his glow faded to a dim silver, his skin lined with deep creases. He wore the plain robes of a palace servant, but his hands were thick with calluses. "I am Orith," the old one said. "I keep the weapons, have done so for 90 years. No one visits this room. These are different from the ones outside," Ethan said, picking up a straight-edged blade. It was heavier than it looked. "Those outside are for show. These were made for the founding wars before we decided killing was beneath us." Orith studied him. "You are the human." "I am. They say you are not worthy of the princess. They say a lot of things." Orith made a sound that might have been a laugh. "Sit. Tell me about your wars." Ethan sat. They talked for 2 hours. Orith asked questions that no other Sithari had asked, not about tactics or casualty numbers, but about what it felt like, what it cost, what it took from the people who survived. Ethan answered honestly, and Orith listened with the careful attention of someone who understood that fighting was not a theory. It was a scar that lived inside you. When Ethan left, Orith called after him. "The rite of contestation has 3 trials. You know this." "I do. The first will be the trial of mind. Lord Vithos will choose the psionic labyrinth, the Veilum Crucible. It attacks the mind with fear and memory and despair. The Sithari survive it with psionic shields." He paused. "You have no such shields." "I know." Orith nodded slowly. "Then you will have to survive it some other way." His dim eyes held something that Ethan could not quite name, not pity, not hope, but something in between. Come back tomorrow. There are things in this room that may serve you better than anything the court will offer. Ethan returned to his quarters that night and sat in the dark. Through the crystal walls, he could see the stars, thousands of them, scattered across the void like spilled salt. Somewhere out there was Earth. Somewhere closer was Calith, locked in her purification chambers, fighting her own battles against a family that wanted her to abandon him. He thought about the Crucible, a machine that would tear open his mind and pour fire into every crack. No shields, no defenses, just him and whatever lived inside his head. He had a lot living inside his head. On the third morning, Lord Vitho's kin stood before the assembled court and formally announced the 3 trials. His voice rang through the grand hall like a bell, confident and sharp. The first trial shall be the trial of mind, the Valem Crucible. A murmur swept through the crowd. Even the nobles who supported the right looked uncomfortable. The Crucible was not a test. It was a sentence. No non-Sithari had ever survived it. Vithos smiled at Ethan across the hall. It was the smile of a man who had already won. Ethan looked back at him with steady eyes and said nothing at all. The Valem Crucible sat in the center of the trial chamber like a throne made of nightmares. It was a ring of black crystal pillars, each one twice the height of a man, arranged in a perfect circle. The air between them shimmered with energy that had no color but made the eyes ache if you looked at it too long. This was old technology, not the elegant, refined kind that the modern Sithari were proud of, but something raw and ancient, built when the Dominion still believed that pain was the truest test of character. The trial chamber was packed. Every noble house had sent representatives. Floating observation platforms held hundreds of Sithari, their glowing skin creating a galaxy of soft light above the arena floor. The Arch-Sovereign herself watched from a sealed balcony, her face unreadable behind a veil of golden light. Beside her, Crown Prince Sethal stood with his arms folded and his expression cold. Calith was there too. She had been allowed to attend but not to speak. She stood on a lower platform, dressed in white, her hands gripping the railing so tightly that her glow pulsed in unsteady waves. Ethan walked into the trial chamber alone. He wore his military uniform, the same gray one he had arrived in, now cleaned and pressed. No armor, no weapons. Against the shimmering majesty of the Sithari court, he looked painfully ordinary. That was the point. Every detail of this event had been designed to make him look small. Lord Vithos stood on the observation platform directly across from the Crucible. He addressed the court in a voice that carried effortlessly through the enormous space. The Valem Crucible tests the mind's ability to withstand the deepest fears and darkest memories of the subject. The Sithari endure it through psionic shielding, the natural gift of our species. The subject before us possesses no such gift. He paused for effect. Let us see what remains when there is nothing to hide behind. Ethan stepped into the circle of pillars. The air changed immediately, heavier, colder, charged with something that pressed against his skull like invisible fingers. A low hum filled his ears, rising in pitch until it became a sound he could feel in his teeth. Then the Crucible activated, and the world disappeared. He was back on Rithai's Vale. The sky was burning. Not figuratively, the upper atmosphere had been set on fire by hive marrow bombardment, and the clouds themselves were sheets of orange flame. The air tasted like hot metal and blood. Ethan was running through a collapsed corridor, his rifle in one hand, his other arm hanging useless from the spike that had gone through his shoulder 3 hours ago. Corporal Davis was beside him. Then Corporal Davis was not beside him because something came through the wall, a hive drone, all black chitin and blades, and Davis simply came apart. 1 second a person, the next second not. Ethan kept running. He could not stop. Stopping meant dying. This was not a memory. It was the memory amplified, sharpened, stripped of every defense his mind had built over the years. Every detail was perfect and merciless. He could feel the heat, smell the burning, hear the screams of people he had failed to save. The Crucible did not create illusions. It reached into the places where the worst truths lived and pulled them into the light. He fell to his knees on the chamber floor. He could not see the chamber anymore. He could only see the war. Above him, the Sithari court watched through the psionic link that connected them to the Crucible's output. This was how they experienced the trial, not as distant observers, but as witnesses who could feel echoes of what the subject felt. It was meant to be uncomfortable. A Sithari going through the crucible would project controlled fear, managed pain, proof that their mind could shape even the worst experience into something ordered and survivable. What Ethan projected was something else entirely. The court felt everything, raw, unfiltered. There were no psionic shields softening the edges. Every scream, every death, every moment of pure animal terror poured through the link like floodwater through a broken dam. A Sithari noblewoman on the nearest platform gasped and pressed her hand over her mouth. A military officer disconnected from the link entirely, his glow flickering wildly. Two younger nobles stumbled back from the railing as if they had been struck. They had never felt anything like this. The Sithari lived long lives in a civilization that had spent 10,000 years removing discomfort. They experienced loss and sadness, but rarely the kind of brutal, immediate, overwhelming suffering that came from standing in a collapsing building while the people around you died screaming. It was not just the pain that shook them, it was the scale of it, how much of it there was, how deep it went, and the fact that the human on the chamber floor had lived through all of it and was still alive to remember. The crucible shifted, new memories. The field hospital after Rithai's Vale, where Ethan sat beside a 19-year-old Marine named Reyes who had lost both legs below the knee and kept asking if he could still go home. The funeral service on the carrier deck, where 37 names were read to an audience of exhausted survivors who could barely stand. The quiet night when Ethan sat alone in his quarters and stared at the wall for 4 hours without moving, because if he moved he would have to feel something, and he was not ready to feel anything yet. Minutes passed. The crucible pounded him with every wound his mind carried. He was on his hands and knees, shaking, sweat dripping from his face to the crystal floor. But he did not fall. He did not scream. He did not beg for it to stop. He simply endured. The crucible ran for 12 minutes. For a Sithari with full psionic defenses, the standard duration was 10. No one had expected Ethan to last more than 2. When the pillars finally powered down and the shimmering air went still, Ethan was still on his knees. Slowly, painfully, he put one foot on the ground, then the other. He stood. His body was trembling, his face was white and slick with sweat, and his eyes had the hollow look of someone who had been dragged through hell and refused to stay there. He stood. The trial chamber was silent, not the polite silence of an audience waiting for the next act, but the deep, shaken silence of people who had just seen something they did not know how to process. On the observation platforms, dozens of nobles avoided each other's eyes. Some had tears on their faces and did not seem to know why. In the back of the gallery, old Master Orith stood with his arms folded. He watched the human stand on his shaking legs, and he whispered to no one in particular, "Ah, so that is what they are." The trial arbiter, a senior judge in ceremonial robes, stood and spoke into the silence. His voice was unsteady. "The subject has survived the Valem crucible. The trial of mind is past." Lord Vithos said nothing. His face was carved from stone, but his glow had dimmed to a color that suggested something between fury and something he would never admit was doubt. Ethan walked out of the circle on his own power. He did not look at Vithos. He did not look at the crowd. He looked at Caliph. She was gripping the railing with white knuckles, her glow burning so bright it hurt to look at directly. She did not speak. She did not need to. Everything she felt was written in light across her skin. The court was given 4 hours to recover before the second trial. Most of them needed it. The trial of body was held in the same chamber, reconfigured into a dueling arena. The crystal pillars had been cleared away, replaced by a wide circle of polished stone marked with ancient combat symbols. The rules were traditional: first to yield, first to fall unconscious, or first blood 3 times. Vithos chose the champion himself. Kale Dreth was everything Ethan was not: 7 feet tall, impossibly fast, built from generations of genetic refinement. He carried 2 curved blades with edges that hummed with energy. He was the finest blade dancer in the third reach, and he walked into the arena like a predator entering a cage with something small and soft. Ethan was offered traditional Sithari weapons. He examined them one by one, curved, balanced, beautiful. Then he turned to the arbiter. "Something simpler," he said. "A straight blade, single edge." Master Orith appeared from the crowd as if he had been waiting for exactly this moment. He carried a blade wrapped in old cloth. When he unwrapped it, the sword inside was plain, heavy, and ancient. It had no decorations. It had no energy edge. It was just sharpened steel, made a very long time ago for the purpose of keeping someone alive. Ethan took it, felt its weight, and nodded. The duel began, and Dreth was magnificent. He moved like water, flowing, spinning, every strike a work of art that drew gasps from the audience. His first cut opened a thin line across Ethan's forearm before the human could even react. First blood. The crowd cheered. Dreth pressed his advantage with dazzling combinations of strikes that forced Ethan back across the arena. Second blood, a slice across the thigh. Dreth smiled and played to the audience, raising his blades in a gesture of elegant dominance. But Ethan was watching. Behind the pain and the blood, he was studying every pattern, every habit, every tiny tell in Dreth's footwork. The Sithari style was beautiful, but beauty required repetition, and repetition created openings. Dreth launched a sweeping overhead strike, a crowd-pleasing move that left his left side exposed for half a second. Ethan stepped forward instead of back. He took the cut across his ribs, a third line of blood, and drove his shoulder into Dreth's chest while the taller fighter was still mid-swing. The impact staggered Dreth backward. Before he could recover, Ethan's blade came up in a short, vicious arc that knocked one curved sword out of Dreth's hand and sent it spinning across the floor. The arena went quiet. Ethan pressed forward with everything he had. There was no beauty in it, no art, no performance. It was fast, efficient, and brutal, the kind of fighting that was not designed to impress anyone but only to win. Dreth tried to recover, but Ethan gave him no space. A low strike to the knee, a pommel blow to the wrist that sent the second blade flying, a final sweep that took Dreth's legs out from under him and put him flat on his back with Ethan's blade resting against his throat. The hall held its breath. Ethan pulled the blade back and extended his hand. Dreth stared up at him, beaten, bleeding, breathing hard. Something shifted in his expression. He reached up and took Ethan's hand, and the human pulled him to his feet. The silence broke into something complicated, not cheering, not anger, but the sound of a crowd that had just watched something it did not expect and did not know how to feel about. Lord Vithos stepped forward. His voice cut through the noise like a blade. "The final trial," he said, "shall be the trial of spirit, and I shall conduct it myself." The murmur that followed was different. It was the sound of fear. The ancient law allowed the challenger to serve as the instrument of the final test. Vithos was not just announcing a trial. He was announcing a fight to the death. He looked directly at Ethan with eyes that held no mercy. "I hope you have made your peace, human." The palace medical wing was a cathedral of light and silence. Beds floated on cushions of anti-gravity, surrounded by diagnostic fields that could read every cell in a body and repair damage at a speed that human medicine could only dream of. The Sithari physicians offered Ethan the full treatment, regenerative therapy that would close his wounds in minutes, restore his blood, and leave him in perfect condition for the morning. He refused. "Regenerative therapy requires 6 hours of immobility," he said. "I need to be ready by dawn. Then you will fight Lord Vithos with open wounds." The lead physician replied, her tone suggesting this was the most foolish thing she had ever heard. Wouldn't be the first time. He took the basic treatment, disinfection, wound sealing, and pain management that he turned down to half strength because full strength made his thoughts slow. Then he returned to his quarters and stitched the deeper cuts himself with a field kit he had brought from his ship. The Sithari stitchwork was neater, but his own hands had done this 100 times. There was a comfort in the familiar. The palace was different that night. Ethan felt it as he walked the corridors. Servants who had ignored him for 3 days now paused when he passed. They did not speak, but they looked at him differently. A kitchen worker left a tray of food outside his door, real food, well prepared, not the scraps he had been served at the low table. A young attendant who had been reassigned away from him appeared briefly to leave a folded blanket on his bed. Small gestures, quiet ones, but they were there. Word of what had happened in the trial chamber had spread through the palace like fire. Ethan ate alone and thought about tomorrow. Lord Vithos' kin was not Kael Dreth. Dreth had been a fighter, skilled, proud, but ultimately a performer. Vithos was something else. He had killed 11 opponents in honor combat over the course of his career. Not all of them had been necessary. Some had been political. Vithos used the dueling code the way other nobles used votes and bribes as a tool to remove obstacles. He was fast, technically perfect, and completely willing to kill. A knock at the door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it expecting a servant. Instead, he found Kalith. She stood in the corridor wearing a simple robe, her glow dimmed to the soft warmth of candlelight. Her ritual purification guards were nowhere in sight. She had broken protocol to be here. In Sithari culture, this was not a small thing. It was a deliberate act of defiance that would carry consequences. "You should not be here," Ethan said. "I know." She stepped inside and the door closed behind her. For a moment they simply stood in the quiet of the room. The crystal walls showed the stars outside, cold, distant, and indifferent to everything happening on this small, bright station. "Vithos has killed 11 opponents," Kalith said. 12, if you count the one that died of wounds a week after the duel. She looked at him with eyes that held more light than the stars outside. "You investigated him." "I investigate everyone, habit." She moved closer. Her glow shifted, warmer, deeper, the colors of emotion that the Sithari could not hide no matter how hard they tried. "Ethan, I brought you into this. I asked you to come here to stand in a court that hates you, to face trials that were designed to destroy you. If you die tomorrow, then I die doing something that mattered. That is not good enough." Her voice was firm, and for a moment she sounded less like a princess and more like the officer he had pulled out of a collapsing bunker on Rithai's Vale. "I will not stand on a platform and watch you bleed out on a stone floor. I would rather dissolve the bond myself." Ethan was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was steady. "I've been afraid since I got here. Every day, every hour. Fear's not the problem, quitting is." She stared at him. He stared back. The space between them was small and enormous at the same time. "Why?" she asked. "Because someone told me once that the galaxy doesn't change by itself. Someone has to walk into the room and refuse to leave." He paused. "That was you, by the way. You said that on the 3rd night after Rithai's Vale. We were sitting on ammunition crates and you were angry about the peace negotiations." Her glow flared, surprise, warmth, and something that might have been the Sithari equivalent of tears. She reached out and took his hand. Her skin was warm, almost hot, and the light beneath it pulsed in rhythm with her heartbeat. They sat together in the dark and talked, not about the trial or the court or the politics, about small things, about the foods he missed from Earth and the garden she had tended as a child, about the sound of rain, which Vilthara did not have because the weather was controlled, and which Ethan described with such detail that Kalith said she wanted to visit a planet where water fell from the sky like a gift no one had asked for. She left before dawn. At the door she turned back. "When?" she said. "Yes, ma'am." An hour later there was another knock. Ethan opened the door to find Crown Prince Sethal standing in the corridor. Where Kalith had come in warmth, her brother arrived in ice. He was taller than her, sharper in feature, and his glow was the controlled, even white of someone who never let emotion touch his surface. "I do not like you," Sethal said by way of greeting. "I know. I did not approve of my sister's choice. I told her it was sentimental, reckless, and politically destructive." "She mentioned that." Sethal studied him with the calculating gaze of someone who evaluated everything in terms of advantage. "But Vithos' kin is not fighting for tradition. He is fighting for power. If he kills you tomorrow, it will not simply end a bonding. It will humiliate the arch-sovereign, destabilize the throne, and give House Kin the leverage to challenge the succession." Ethan nodded. He had figured this out on the first night. "You knew," Sethal said. "It was not a question. Your court is complicated, but the patterns are the same everywhere. Someone wants the throne. Someone else is in the way." Sethal reached into his robe and produced a data crystal. "Vithos favors his left side, an old injury to the hip that he compensates for with footwork. When he commits to a killing stroke, he shifts his weight forward and his right heel lifts from the ground. For 1/2 second, he is unbalanced." He placed the crystal on a side table. "This contains recordings of his last 6 duels. I suggest you study them." "Why are you helping me?" "I am not helping you. I am protecting the crown." Sethal turned to leave, then stopped. "But if you survive tomorrow and bring shame to my sister, I will ensure you regret it personally." "Fair enough." Sethal left without another word. Ethan picked up the data crystal and spent the remaining hours before dawn watching every second of Vithos's fighting style. The prince was right. The left side weakness was subtle, almost invisible, but it was there. A ghost of old damage that showed itself only in the moments of highest commitment. As the first light of Velthara's artificial dawn crept through the crystal walls, another visitor arrived. Master Orith carried the ancient blade wrapped in its old cloth. He unwrapped it slowly, reverently, and held it out. The sword had been transformed. The edge was freshly ground, sharp enough to catch light and hold it. The grip had been rewrapped in new leather. The old steel gleamed with the deep, honest shine of a thing that had been cared for by someone who understood what it was. "This blade was forged during the founding wars," Orith said. "Before art, before elegance, before we decided we were too civilized to get blood on our hands." He looked at Ethan with eyes that burned with quiet intensity. It was made for a style of combat that valued only one thing, keeping the one who held it alive. It was made for someone like you. Ethan took the blade. It felt right. It felt like it had been waiting. "Thank you," he said. Orith bowed, a full bow, the kind that Sithari gave to equals. "Show them," the old man said quietly. "Show them what they have forgotten about themselves." The grand unification hall filled before the sun had fully risen. Every great house sent their highest-ranking members. Diplomats from a dozen species filled the observation galleries. Camera drones from every major news network in the Dominion hovered in formation above the arena floor. This was no longer just a trial. It was the most-watched event in the Dominion in a generation. The Arch-Sovereign sat upon the crystal throne, elevated above the entire hall. Her expression was hidden behind ceremonial light, but her presence alone was a statement. The ruler of the Dominion was watching, and she would remember everything that happened today. Lord Vithos entered from the east gate. He wore light combat armor of polished white, and in each hand he carried a phase-edged crescent, weapons whose vibrating edges could cut through starship hull plating. He moved with the easy confidence of a man who had done this before and always won. The crowd greeted him with respectful silence. He was, after all, one of the most powerful nobles in the Dominion. Ethan entered from the west gate, gray uniform, old sword, no armor. The crowd's silence became something else, something heavier. Pity, perhaps, or anticipation of a kind that made people uncomfortable. Vithos planted himself in the center of the arena and waited. Ethan walked forward to meet him. The arbiter's voice rang through the hall. "The trial of spirit begins." The first strike came before the arbiter's voice had finished echoing through the hall. Vithos closed the distance between them in a single fluid motion and brought both crescent blades down in a scissoring arc aimed at Ethan's neck. The phase edges hummed, a high, thin sound like a wasp made of light. Ethan threw himself sideways. The blades passed through the space where his throat had been and bit into the stone floor, leaving two glowing scars in the polished surface. He rolled, came up with his sword raised, and barely caught the follow-up strike, a low sweep aimed at his legs. The impact traveled up through his arms like an electric shock. Vithos was stronger than Dreth, much stronger, and faster. The Sithari Lord moved with the precision of someone who had turned violence into a science. He did not waste a single motion. Every strike flowed into the next. Every step placed him at the perfect angle. Every feint was designed to pull Ethan out of position. Within the first 30 seconds, Ethan had been cut twice. A shallow line across his left forearm and a deeper slash along his hip that bled freely through his uniform. The crowd watched in silence. There was no cheering for either side. The gravity of what was happening had settled over the hall like a fog. This was not a performance. This was a killing in progress. Vithos pressed his advantage with methodical cruelty. He was not rushing. He was dismantling Ethan one piece at a time, cutting the arms that held the sword, the legs that kept him standing, the shoulders that allowed him to swing. Each wound was precise and intentional, designed to weaken without finishing. He wanted this to last. He wanted the court to see every moment of the human's failure. "You are bleeding, Commander," Vithos said, circling to the right. His voice was calm and conversational, as if they were discussing the weather over drinks. "You will bleed faster soon. Then you will fall. Then this farce will end." Ethan said nothing. He kept his blade up and his feet under him, turning with Vithos, conserving energy he could not afford to waste. Blood dripped from his arm to the stone floor in a steady rhythm. Vithos struck again, a whirling combination that came from 3 angles in less than a second. Ethan blocked the first, dodged the second, and took the third across his right shoulder. The pain was sharp and immediate, and his grip on the sword loosened for an instant. Vithos saw it and drove forward with a lunging thrust aimed at Ethan's chest. Ethan twisted. The crescent blade caught his side instead of his heart, opening a long cut across his ribs. He staggered back, breathing hard, and for the first time his knee dipped toward the ground. A sound rippled through the crowd, not a gasp, but something quieter. The sound of people watching something inevitable and trying to prepare themselves for it. On her observation platform, Kalith stood perfectly still. Her glow had gone white, the color of absolute control, the color a Sithari wore when every emotion was being held inside by force of will alone. Her hands were at her sides, her fingers curled into fists so tight that light bled through the cracks. Vithos stepped back and lowered his blade slightly. He turned to address the court, his voice carrying to the highest galleries. "You see what stands before you. This is humanity, fragile, limited, stubborn perhaps, but stubbornness is not strength. It is the refusal of a lesser creature to accept its place." He swept one crescent blade in a wide arc that encompassed the arena, the crowd, and the crystal throne above. "I call upon the Arch-Sovereign to recognize what is plain to all. Dissolve this bond. Remove this human from our space. Let the Dominion remember what it is, the highest civilization in the galaxy, unsullied by sentiment and the delusions of a dying princess." The words hit the hall like a slap. Calling Kalith dying was a metaphor, a suggestion that her judgment was so compromised that she was already lost. It was an insult not just to her, but to the Arch-Sovereign who had permitted the bonding to proceed. Several nobles flinched. Even some of Vithos's allies looked uncomfortable. But Vithos was confident. He had won. The human was bleeding on the floor. The point was made. He turned his back on Ethan and looked up at the crystal throne, waiting for the Arch-Sovereign's response. He turned his back. Ethan moved. There was no warning, no battle cry, no dramatic speech. One moment he was on one knee with blood running down his side. The next he was on his feet and crossing the distance between them with a speed that came from somewhere deeper than muscle, from the place where humans kept the things that would not die no matter how much punishment the world threw at them. Vithos heard the footsteps and spun, bringing both crescent blades up in a defensive cross. He was fast. He was possibly the fastest fighter in the Dominion. He was not fast enough. Ethan's old sword came in low, not at the blades but at the hands that held them. The edge caught Vithos's right wrist at the gap between his armor plates. The crescent blade clattered to the floor. Before Vithos could adjust, Ethan was inside his guard, too close for the remaining crescent to be effective. He drove his shoulder into the Sithari lord's chest, using his entire body weight to force him backward. Vithos stumbled. His left heel lifted off the ground, the old injury, the weakness Sethal had described. For 1/2 second his balance failed him. Ethan did not waste the 1/2 second. He brought the pommel of his sword down on Vithos's remaining wrist. The second crescent blade fell. He kicked it away, reversed his grip, and swept Vithos's legs in a single brutal motion that put the lord flat on his back on the arena floor. The sound of Vithos hitting stone echoed through a hall that had gone so silent that Ethan could hear his own blood dripping. He stood over the fallen lord with his blade pointed at Vithos's throat. The ancient steel was steady. His hands were not. Blood covered him, his own and Vithos's, and his breathing was ragged and raw. He looked like a man who had been dragged through a war, because in every way that mattered he had been. The hall did not breathe. Hundreds of the most powerful beings in the galaxy watched a wounded, bleeding, psionic null human hold a blade to the throat of one of their greatest lords, and not a single one of them made a sound. Vithos looked up at him. His glow had gone pale, the color of shock, the color of a reality that did not match the one he had built his entire life around. But his voice was steady. "Do it then," he said through gritted teeth. "Prove what your species is." Ethan held the blade where it was. 1 second, 2, 3. The steel was close enough to Vithos's skin that the Sithari Lord could feel its cold edge. Then Ethan pulled the blade back. He lifted it high, reversed it, and drove it into the stone floor beside Vithos's head. The ancient steel sank 3 inches into crystal and stood there, vibrating. "My species," Ethan said quietly, "is the one that gets to choose." He stepped back from Vithos and turned away. Not quickly, not dramatically. He simply turned and walked across the arena toward the platform where Caliph stood. He walked slowly because his body was failing and every step cost him something, but he walked under his own power and he did not look back. The silence held for 5 heartbeats. Then the Arch-Sovereign rose from the crystal throne. She had not spoken publicly during the entire rite. She had observed, as was traditional, allowing the law to play out without interference. But now she stood, and the light of the throne blazed around her like a sun. "The 3 trials are complete," she said. Her voice was not loud, but it reached every corner of the hall as if the walls themselves were carrying it. "The consort has passed. The rite of contestation is satisfied." She descended from the throne, something that had not been done in living memory. Step by step, the supreme ruler of 100 star systems walked down from her seat of power to the floor of the arena. The crowd parted before her like water. She stopped in the center of the hall and spoke the words of bonding herself, not through an officiant, not through a proxy. The Arch-Sovereign, mother of the bride, ruler of the Dominion, personally spoke the ancient words that sealed the union. The political meaning was unmistakable. This was not tolerance. This was endorsement. Caliph descended from her platform. She walked to Ethan and stopped in front of him. Her glow was blazing, gold and white, and every warm color the Sithari spectrum could produce. It was the outward expression of everything she felt, and she made no effort to hide it. "Let the court see." She took his hands. His were rough, scarred, and covered in blood. Hers were smooth, warm, and bright enough to cast shadows. "You're bleeding on my dress," she said. "Sorry about that." "Don't be." The bonding was sealed. In the weeks that followed, the Dominion changed. Not quickly, not dramatically, but in the way that deep currents shift beneath an ocean. House Kin lost 3 political allies within a month. Lord Vithos withdrew from public life, his reputation damaged beyond recovery, not because he had lost the duel, but because the human he had tried to humiliate had shown him mercy he had not shown others. The contrast was devastating. Joint human-Sithari military operations doubled in efficiency as the 2 species began to genuinely coordinate rather than merely cooperate. Cultural exchange programs were proposed, and for the first time approved. Smaller species within the Dominion, races that had been dismissed as primitive or insignificant for centuries, began petitioning for the same recognition that humanity had just earned. The precedent was set. 1 month after the bonding, Ethan stood on a balcony overlooking Velthara's crystal seas. He wore Sithari formal dress now, though he had insisted on a human-style collar that the court tailors had struggled with. The cuts had healed, the scars had not, and he had no intention of removing them. Caliph joined him. She leaned against the railing and looked out at the horizon, where the artificial sun was painting the sky in shades of violet and gold. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked, "coming here?" He was quiet for a moment. "Every single day, right up until I didn't." She smiled and leaned her shoulder against his. Her glow settled into the deep, steady warmth that meant she was exactly where she wanted to be. Across the Dominion, in barracks and mess halls and frontier outposts on 100 different worlds, humans and Sithari watched the recording of the final trial together. It had been broadcast everywhere and had become the most viewed event in Dominion history. They watched the human bleed. They watched him fall. They watched him get back up and do something none of them had expected. In a border station on the edge of the Outer Reach, a young Sithari soldier finished watching the recording and turned to the human Marine sitting beside her in the mess hall. The Marine was eating something unidentifiable with a plastic fork and humming a song the Sithari did not recognize. "Are all your people like that?" the Sithari asked. The human looked up, grinned, and said, "On a good day." The stars burned on above them, ancient and indifferent, but down below, in the small spaces where people actually lived and worked and bled for each other, something had changed. It was not a revolution. It was not a conquest. It was something quieter and more dangerous than either. It was a beginning.